Laura and David Miller looked like the perfect couple, but behind the walls of their suburban home, David was hiding a shocking secret. A secret apartment across town, a double life, and a betrayal that would spiral into deadly violence. Laura and David Miller were the kind of couple people admired. They lived in a comfortable suburban neighborhood with neat lawns, quiet streets, and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed. David had built a reputation as a hard-working professional. In finance, the type of man who wore crisp suits and shook hands with confidence. Laura was warm, attentive, and proud of the life they had built together. Their friends envied their stability, often commenting on how David seemed devoted, never straying, never showing a hint of trouble. On the surface, everything looked solid, but appearances can be carefully crafted, and David was a man skilled at hiding. Behind his carefully polished image, David carried a secret he guarded with obsessive precision, while Laura thought he was traveling for work or working late at the office. David was often miles away in a different part of town, not at a bar, not with coworkers, but in a place Laura didn't even know existed. He had an apartment, not just a room rented casually, but a second home hidden from view, fully furnished, decorated, and paid for without his wife's knowledge. This apartment was the beginning of the unraveling. From the outside, the building seemed ordinary, a mid-rise complex with secure entry, neutral-colored walls, and a lobby filled with plants that tried to give the illusion of homeliness. No one would have thought twice about a man in a suit carrying groceries or a gym bag into the building. That was part of the plan. David blended seamlessly into the crowd of tenants, creating a version of himself that was completely detached from his marriage. Inside the apartment, everything told a different story. The furniture was expensive but impersonal, the kind of modern pieces you'd expect to see in a staged home. There were art prints on the walls, none of which Laura had ever seen, and personal items that hinted at another identity. A second cell phone lay on the coffee table, often left on silent mode, used for calls Laura would never know about. Drawers held clothes Laura never bought, casual shirts, sneakers, and even toiletries duplicated so he wouldn't need to carry items back and forth. Every detail was calculated to sustain a double life without leaving traces in his primary home. What made the secret even more unsettling was how careful David was at keeping it invisible. He never used their shared credit card for anything linked to the apartment. Rent payments came from an account Laura didn't know about. His supposed business trips conveniently aligned with weekends spent in the apartment. Every excuse, every story he told her, was constructed with just enough detail to sound believable. Yet, as careful as he was, the very existence of the apartment raised troubling questions. Why did he need it? Was it for work, for solitude, or for something far darker? When you think about someone you trust hiding an entire residence from you, your mind naturally runs to possibilities. And viewers, let's be honest, if your partner had a hidden apartment, what would be the first thing you'd think? Go ahead and comment below, because the theories are endless. To Laura, life went on without suspicion. She believed her husband's long hours and constant travel were signs of ambition, not deception. She enjoyed the dinners they shared at home, the vacations they took once or twice a year, and the stories he told about demanding clients. She never questioned the gaps, because David gave her no obvious reason to doubt him. He was attentive, remembered anniversaries, and even surprised her with flowers on occasion. The balance between their life together and his hidden world was flawless for a time, but secrets like these rarely stay buried forever. David wasn't just managing two schedules. He was building two separate identities. In one, he was the responsible family man. In the other, he was free from the expectations of marriage. Each time he crossed the threshold of that hidden apartment, he stepped into a role that had nothing to do with Laura, and while he thought he had mastered the art of deception, his life was on the verge of collapsing. It's often said that double lives eventually collide, and David's secret was no exception. The more he spent time at the apartment, the more tangled his lies became. He told Laura he had late meetings, but then failed to keep his stories straight. He claimed to be traveling out of state, yet receipts and small traces of his time in the city piled up. Laura didn't see them yet, but cracks had begun to form. And once the cracks were there, all it would take was one wrong step for the entire structure of his lies to come crashing down. Imagine, for a moment, finding out that the person you've shared your life with has another place. A place that has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with your shared history. Would you assume it's harmless? Maybe an escape from stress? Or would you suspect something far worse? This is the kind of secret that changes everything once it's revealed. For now, Laura was blissfully unaware. But David's apartment wasn't just a place of escape. It was a ticking time bomb. And before long, the truth hiding behind those walls would turn deadly. The apartment was more than a hidden address. It was the stage for a second life that David had carefully curated. During the day, he played the role of the reliable husband and professional. At night, or on weekends, he became someone else entirely. The neighbors in the complex knew him as friendly but private. A man who paid his rent on time and often carried bags of groceries up the stairs. To them, he was single. No one ever heard him mention a wife waiting at home in the suburbs. Inside those four walls, David's carefully guarded world looked nothing like the one he shared with Laura. Investigators would later note the unusual mix of items in the apartment. There were men's clothes in the closet, but also women's toiletries in the bathroom. A sleek vanity stood against the bedroom wall, stocked with makeup and hair products. These things were not Laura's, and they painted a picture that was impossible to deny. David was living with another woman, or at the very least, maintaining a relationship strong enough that she left her belongings behind. The second phone found in the living room told an even darker story. On it were hundreds of text messages and calls that Laura had never seen. Long conversations with someone who clearly believed David belonged to her alone. The messages spoke of love, jealousy, and sometimes tension. This wasn't a casual fling, it was a relationship that ran deep enough to inspire commitment, and in some cases, conflict. What makes stories like this chilling is the level of control someone like David could maintain. By day, he smiled across the dinner table at Laura, telling her about fictional clients and impossible workloads. By night, he promised a future to another woman who thought she was the only one. He kept both lives separate, weaving stories to cover any overlap. But what he failed to see was how fragile that balance really was. When lies stack on top of each other, all it takes is one small inconsistency to topple everything. Neighbors at the apartment complex recalled seeing the woman regularly. She was younger, lively, and often laughed with David as they carried bags of takeout upstairs. They looked like any other couple, building a life together, never revealing the truth behind closed doors. Some of the neighbors were shocked later when they learned about his real wife, saying they had no idea he wasn't single. David had played the role too well. For those of you watching, take a moment to think about this. How well do we really know the people closest to us? Could someone you love be leading a second life without you realizing? If you've ever had a suspicion like this, share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like these remind us how easy it is for someone determined to keep secrets to succeed, at least for a while. The hidden apartment became more than a backdrop to infidelity. It was where David shed one skin and stepped into another. For Laura, the hours he claimed to spend in boardrooms or airports were actually spent lounging on a leather sofa with someone else. For the woman across town, those same hours were filled with promises about a shared future, vacations that never materialized, and an illusion of exclusivity. David was two men at once, switching roles seamlessly, confident he would never be caught, but the cracks were already visible to anyone paying attention. His supposed travel schedule didn't always align with flight records. His expense reports showed inconsistencies. Even his stories sometimes contradicted themselves. To Laura, these things seemed minor, easy to brush off. To the other woman, however, the lies were harder to ignore. She wanted more. She began pressing for clarity, questioning the long disappearances and vague answers. And while David thought he could keep both worlds spinning, he was beginning to lose control. What's chilling about the double life is that it thrives on silence. Neither woman knew the other existed, which gave David absolute power. But as the relationship in the apartment deepened, so did the risks. The second woman was no longer content to stay in the shadows. She wanted permanence, acknowledgement, and the security of knowing she wasn't just a secret. She had invested time, emotions, and parts of her life into someone she believed was hers. And when someone feels deceived, the anger that follows can push them to extremes. David was skilled at buying time, but every lie he told added weight to a structure already unstable. His charm and confidence kept suspicion at bay, but the mask was slipping. What he didn't realize was that both women were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. For Laura, small inconsistencies were starting to gnaw at her. For the woman across town, doubt was becoming unbearable. Both were on a collision course with David's lies, and he had no way of stopping it. The apartment, once his sanctuary, was now becoming dangerous. It wasn't just a place to escape. It was a space filled with tension and demands that he couldn't meet. And soon, it would no longer be just a backdrop for secrecy. It would become the scene of something irreversible, something far more sinister than deception. Laura's suspicion began quietly, as it so often does. At first, she brushed it off as paranoia. David had always seemed reliable, even affectionate in his own reserved way. But once the seed of doubt was planted, it grew quickly. She noticed receipts from restaurants she had never visited with him. A jacket she didn't recognize slipped into the back seat of his car. And most of all, his work trips became oddly repetitive, often returning on the exact same day of the week, as though scripted. None of it seemed catastrophic on its own, but together it created a pattern too strange to ignore. She decided to stop taking his explanations at face value. When he left one evening for what he claimed was an emergency meeting with a client, Laura followed. She stayed several cars back, careful not to be noticed, her pulse hammering at the thought that she might finally uncover the truth. David drove not toward downtown, where his office was, but across the city, to a neighborhood Laura had no reason to be familiar with. He parked outside a mid-rise apartment building and entered casually, like he belonged there. Laura sat frozen in her car, staring at the lit windows, her world collapsing silently. For weeks, she carried the knowledge alone, gathering small details, checking his schedules, waiting for the right moment. When she could no longer hold back, Laura confronted him in their home. The questions came sharp, her anger carefully controlled at first, but quickly rising as his answers faltered. David tried to deflect, tried to smooth things over with practiced charm. But Laura wasn't the woman she had been before that night in the car. She had seen too much. The confrontation ended with slammed doors, but no resolution. David left the house in a rage, his calm demeanor shattered. The woman at the apartment was reaching her own breaking point. She had grown tired of excuses, tired of living in the shadows. She wanted more than whispered promises and brief visits. She demanded permanence, even going so far as to threaten to call Laura herself if David didn't end the charade. The texts on his second phone revealed her anger escalating, each message sharper than the last. She was no longer willing to be hidden, and that terrified David more than the confrontation with his wife. On the night everything came to a head, neighbors in the apartment complex recalled hearing loud voices echoing through the hall. The argument was fierce, filled with shouting and the unmistakable crash of something breaking. What happened behind that closed door would become the subject of months of investigation, but the outcome was immediate and undeniable. When officers arrived after a neighbor called in a disturbance, the door was unlocked, hanging slightly open as if someone had left in a rush. Inside, The scene was chaos. Furniture overturned, glass shattered on the floor, and in the center of it all, the woman lay motionless. She had been struck with a heavy object, the force of the blow leaving no chance of survival. David was still in the room, his clothes stained, his face pale as he muttered explanations that shifted each time he repeated them. He claimed it was an accident, that she had attacked him first, that he only reacted in panic. But nothing in the room supported his story. The evidence pointed instead to rage and desperation, the result of a man cornered by the lies he could no longer control. The police quickly secured the scene, collecting the weapon, a broken lamp from the side table, smeared with fingerprints that matched David's. The neighbors were interviewed, each recounting the shouting they heard, the sense of dread that had settled in even before the sirens arrived. The story David told did not match their accounts. His alibi, that he had been on his way out when the fight turned violent, fell apart under scrutiny. Laura was called to the station hours later. Sitting in the sterile interview room, she listened in stunned silence as detectives explained what had happened. The betrayal she had uncovered now carried a weight she hadn't imagined. It wasn't just infidelity, it was death. Her husband hadn't just lied to her, he had destroyed another life, and in doing so, had destroyed hers as well. The breaking point had come swiftly, but it had been building for months, perhaps years. Each lie, each secret, had stacked upon the other until the inevitable collapse. The apartment that once represented escape now stood as a crime scene, its walls carrying the echoes of violence. David's double life had finally collided, and the outcome was irreversible. The perfect mask he wore in public had cracked open, revealing the chaos beneath. For Laura, the truth was unbearable. For investigators, it was a puzzle that needed no guesswork. The evidence was clear. David's carefully constructed world had imploded, and with it, the illusion of the perfect husband had been shattered forever. The trial revealed everything David had worked so hard to bury. What once looked like a calculated double life unraveled into a tale of lies, obsession, and fear. Prosecutors laid out the story, piece by piece, starting with the secret apartment and building toward the night of the crime. They showed jurors photographs of the apartment as it had been found, wine glasses still on the counter, clothes thrown across the bedroom, and the shattered lamp that had become the murder weapon. The crime scene spoke volumes about a man whose secrets had finally caught up with him. The other woman, whose life had ended so abruptly, was no longer just a nameless figure in David's hidden story. Her friends and family came forward, testifying about how she believed she had a real future with him. She had told people close to her that she thought he was the one, never suspecting that he was married. For them, her death was not just a tragedy, but a cruel twist. She had been deceived and, in the end, silenced when she demanded the truth. David's defense tried to argue that the situation had spiraled out of control. They painted him as a man under immense stress, caught between two lives, pushed into a moment of panic he couldn't control. They repeated his claim that the blow had been accidental, the result of self-defense in an argument gone too far. But the evidence told a different story. The broken lamp was heavy, and the angle of the strike suggested deliberate force, not a clumsy accident. Forensic experts testified that the injuries could not have been caused by a single, careless movement. Laura's testimony was one of the most haunting moments of the trial. Sitting in front of strangers, she described the marriage she thought she had, the trust she had placed in David, and the moment she discovered his lies. She spoke quietly, her words steady but filled with grief. She told the jury how she had followed him to the apartment, how she had seen the truth with her own eyes. Her account made it clear that the deception had been meticulous and long-lasting, not a sudden lapse in judgment. The courtroom listened in silence, the weight of betrayal hanging in the air. When surveillance footage was introduced, any remaining doubt disappeared. Cameras from the building showed David entering the apartment that night with the woman, both appearing tense. Hours later, the same cameras captured Laura's car circling the block, as if she had come close to confronting him again. The timing left no room for the defense to claim coincidence. David had been there, the fight had happened, and only he had walked out alive. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty of murder. Guilty of deception so deep it cost another person their life. The sentence was life in prison, a stark contrast to the life of privilege and choice he had built for himself. For a man who had controlled every detail, the courtroom was the place where he lost all control. His mask was stripped away, and his second identity, once hidden behind apartment walls, was now defined by orange prison uniforms and bars. Laura left the courthouse that day, not with relief, but with exhaustion. The man she had trusted had not only betrayed her, but dragged her into a nightmare she could never have imagined. Her marriage had ended in scandal, her reputation scarred by association, and the weight of the trial left her with wounds that would take years to heal. She was not just a victim of infidelity, but of violence that reached into her own life and destroyed the foundation she thought was unshakable. The apartment itself became infamous in the city, a grim reminder of what had taken place inside. Tenants moved out, neighbors whispered, and the building owner struggled to rent the unit again. The space that once represented freedom for David became a symbol of deception and death, an address that would forever be linked to betrayal. Stories like these make people wonder how well they know those closest to them. It is terrifying to think that someone could live under the same roof, share meals, smile across the table, and yet hide an entire life from view. Deception can exist in silence, thriving until the moment it is forced into the light. In David's case, the silence ended violently, leaving scars for everyone involved. The tragedy of this story is not just the murder, but the slow unraveling that led up to it. The secret apartment was not just a setting for betrayal, it was a ticking clock counting down to disaster. David thought he could manage the lies forever, but lies have a way of surfacing, and when they finally did, they left behind shattered families, broken trust, and a life sentence in the end. The tale of David Miller is more than a story about infidelity. It is a story about how secrets, when buried deep enough, grow roots that twist into every part of a person's life until they choke the truth completely. It is a warning about the dangers of deception and a reminder that hidden lives often end not in freedom, but in tragedy.